Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The air inside the airlock tastes like stale copper and old ozone. My Geiger counter is clicking, a slow, rhythmic ticking that syncs up with the pounding of my heart. I shouldn't be here. The coordinates I bought off that dying drifter in Missoula were supposed to lead to a stash site, a simple cache of MREs and 5.56 ammo buried in a PVC pipe. Instead, I found this. A heavy, reinforced steel hatch hidden beneath a layer of artificial turf and dead pine needles deep in the Montana wilderness. I'm breathing hard, trying to steady my hands as I adjust the strap of my rifle. It's quiet now. Too quiet. 5 minutes ago, the forest floor above me was shaking with the shuffling footsteps of the infected. I can still hear the phantom echoes of their wet, gurgling screeches. I had to move fast. I had to slide down that rusted ladder and spin the wheel of this blast door before they smelled my sweat. Now I'm sealed in. And I'm realizing that the silence down here is heavier than the screaming up there. I click on my tactical light. The beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that haven't been disturbed in decades. The floor is concrete, cold and stained with dark fluids that I pray are just hydraulic oil. I take a step forward. My boot crunches on something brittle. I look down. It's not glass. It's bone. A finger bone. Small. Human. Just one. Pointing down the corridor toward the black abyss of the facility. I raise my rifle, tucking the stock tight against my shoulder. The weight of the tactical vest feels good, a familiar hug of ballistic nylon, but the cold down here seeps right through my hoodie. I need to clear the corners. I need to make sure I'm alone. But as I walk deeper into the belly of this concrete beast, passing rows of lockers with names stenciled on them, names that don't sound like soldiers, but scientists, I get a sinking feeling. The lights on the wall are dead, but there's a hum coming from the floor beneath me. Something is running. Something is still alive down here. I reach a heavy bulkhead door labeled Sector 4. It's slightly ajar. Just a crack. Enough for a hand to slip through. Or something worse. I can smell it now. Not the rot of the dead outside. This smells like antiseptic and spoiled meat. A hospital that went bad. I push the door with the barrel of my silencer. It squeals. A high-pitched metal-on-metal scream that echoes down the hall. I freeze. Listening. Waiting. And then I hear it. Not a shuffle. Not a groan. But the distinct, rhythmic tapping of a finger against glass. Coming from inside the lab. I take a breath, hold it, and step through the threshold. The beam of my light sweeps the room. Overturned gurneys. Broken beakers. And in the center, a containment unit. The glass is thick, reinforced. And inside, something is moving. It's not looking at me. It's looking at the door I just came through. It knows what's out there. And for the first time since the fall began, since the cities burned and the dead started walking, I feel true fear. Because the thing in the tank isn't a zombie. It's wearing a uniform. And it's terrified of whatever is standing right behind me. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock ceiling behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in 6 months. It was a mechanical finality, a severance from the screaming world above where the dead refused to stay down. The heavy steel wheel spun into the lock position, and for the first time since the outbreak, the crushing weight of paranoia lifted, replaced instantly by the stale, metallic taste of recycled air. The darkness here wasn't empty, It was pressurized. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that had been suspended in silence for God knows how long. The corridor ahead was concrete, cold, and utilitarian, marked with faded yellow stripes and stenciled letters, Sector A decontamination. I didn't rush. Rushing gets you killed. I swept the beam left, then right, my grip tightening on the crowbar, my only weapon since the Glock ran dry 3 days ago outside of Topeka. The floor was littered with discarded biohazard suits, like shed skins of synthetic snakes. They were empty. No bodies. That was the first good sign, or perhaps the worst. If there were no bodies, it meant they either escaped or they were deeper inside, waiting. I stepped over a discarded clipboard, the plastic crunching like bone under my boot. I needed supplies. My stomach was a hollow pit, gnawing at my spine, and my throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. Moving past the decontamination showers, I found the first heavy door. It was unlocked. The room beyond was a security checkpoint. The glass partition was shattered, shards glittering on the desk like diamonds in the rough. Behind the desk sat a corpse, but not one of them. This was a man in fatigues, a clean hole through the roof of his mouth, a service pistol resting on the floor near his dropped hand. Suicide. The universal exit strategy when the walls started falling. I vaulted the desk, ignoring the grim tableau, and snatched the weapon. A Beretta M9. I checked the mag 7 rounds. 7 chances? I holstered it and rifled through the drawers. Nothing but paperwork and a half-eaten protein bar that had turned to rock. I took the bar anyway. The deeper I went, the more the bunker revealed its secrets. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a research station. The signage changed from living quarters to observation labs. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and copper. I found the generator room on the second level down. The emergency lights were dimming, dying batteries gasping their last, but the main diesel generators were massive beasts, silent and sleeping. I checked the fuel gauges. 3/4 full. A gold mine. With a few primer pumps and a turn of the ignition key, the beasts roared to life. The hum vibrated through the soles of my boots, a heartbeat returning to the complex. Lights flickered, then blazed overhead, blindingly white. Ventilation fans kicked on with a whine that sounded like a jet engine. I had power. I had light. Now I needed to know what they were doing here. I made my way to the mess hall, scavenging as I went. I found a locker room that felt like Christmas morning. A tactical vest, barely used. A filtered water canteen. And miracle of miracles, a sealed crate of MREs, Menu 18, beef ravioli. I ripped one open right there, eating the cold paste with trembling fingers. As the sugar and sodium hit my bloodstream, my brain sharpened. I needed intel. I moved to the server room adjacent to the labs. The computers were password protected, but the main terminal had been left logged in, the user evidently fleeing in a hurry. The screensaver was a rotating DNA helix, but the strands were black and jagged. I sat down, the ergonomic chair groaning, and began to read. The logs were dated 6 months prior to the public outbreak. They knew. They had always known. But as I scrolled through the subject observation files, the blood drained from my face. The narrative I had built in my head, of a virus that killed and reanimated, was wrong. It was incomplete. The file Evolutionary Trajectory Phase 4 detailed the grim reality of the wasteland I had just escaped. The early infected, the shamblers, were merely the larval stage. The virus wasn't just piloting a corpse, It was rebuilding it. Day 45, the log read. Subject 9 displays calcification of the dermis. Small arms fire is becoming ineffective. The bone structure is thickening to protect the brain stem. I thought back to the runner I saw on the highway, the one that took 3 hits from a shotgun and kept coming. It wasn't adrenaline, it was armor. I scrolled down. Day 72, ocular degradation complete. Auditory and olfactory senses heightened by 400%. They are hunting by heartbeat now. They can hear the blood rushing in your veins from 10 meters away. I stopped breathing for a second, listening to the hum of the bunker. Was I safe? Or had I just rung a dinner bell by turning on the generator? I clicked on a video file titled The Screamer Variant. The footage was grainy, black and white observation from a holding cell. A creature vaguely human but with an elongated jaw and distended chest stood in the corner. A researcher in a suit entered. The creature didn't attack. It inhaled, its chest expanding to an impossible size, and unleashed a sound that distorted the microphone so badly the audio cut out. In the video, the glass of the observation deck shattered. The researcher clutched his ears, collapsing as blood poured from his nose. The text below the video was succinct: signal projection. They call the horde. They coordinate. A noise. Not from the computer. From the ventilation duct above my head. A scrape. Metal on metal. I froze. The fans were whirring, but this was rhythmic. Asterisk clang. Drag. Clang. Asterisk something was inside the perimeter. I killed the monitor, plunging the room back into the shadows of the peripheral emergency strips. I drew the Beretta. The sound moved past the server room, heading toward the labs. I had to clear the bunker. If I didn't, I was just canned meat waiting for an opener. I moved into the hallway, weapon raised. The polished floor reflected my silhouette, a ghost haunting a graveyard of science. The lab doors were glass, reinforced but smeared with dried organic matter. Inside, the cages were broken open. Not from the outside, but from the inside. The steel bars were bent outward. I swept the room. Upturned gurneys, shattered microscopes. And there, in the corner, huddled beneath a fume hood, was a shape. It wasn't moving. It wore the tatters of a lab coat. I approached, stepping heel to toe to silence my boots. The figure twitched. It didn't groan. It clicked. A wet, guttural clicking sound from the back of the throat. Echolocation. It stood up, unfolding with unnatural fluidity. It was one of the evolved ones. Its skin was gray and hard, like wet concrete. Its eyes were gone, covered by thick cataracts of scar tissue. It turned its head, tilting it like a bird. It heard my heart. It had to. My pulse was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The creature let out a low hiss, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle teeth that were clearly not human. This was the predator the logs warned about. I didn't wait for it to scream. I raised the Beretta and fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, but instead of tearing through flesh, it sparked. Calcified armor. The impact staggered it, but it didn't fall. It lunged, covering the 20 feet between us in a blur of gray motion. I fired again, aiming for the soft tissue of the open mouth. The round went wide, shattering a beaker on the counter. It crashed into me, slamming me against the wall. The strength was hydraulic. It smelled of ammonia and old blood. I jammed the barrel of the gun under its chin, right into the soft underside of the jaw, and pulled the trigger. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. Black ichor sprayed across my visor. The creature went limp, its weight dragging me down to the floor. I shoved it off, gasping for air, my ears ringing. I scrambled back, keeping the gun trained on the corpse. It didn't move. I checked the slide. Jammed. Stovepipe. I cleared it with shaking hands, chambering a fresh round. I stood up, wiping the slime from my face. I was alive. But the silence that followed was heavy with implication. The logs said they coordinated. If there was one, were there more? I moved back to the corridor, my mind racing. I needed to secure the airlock. I needed to weld the vents. This bunker was a fortress, yes, but it was also a tomb waiting to be sealed. I spent the next 6 hours sweeping every inch of the complex. I found no others, but I found the nest in the lower maintenance tunnels. A pile of bones, stripped clean, and something growing on the walls, a bioluminescent fungus that pulsed in time with the hum of the electricity. The infection was terraforming. It wasn't just changing the people, it was changing the environment to suit the new apex predators. I burned the nest with a makeshift flamethrower fashioned from a can of aerosol lubricant and a lighter, watching the alien growth shrivel and pop. Back in the command center, I watched the external cameras. The sun was setting over the wasteland. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, I saw movement. Not the shambling, aimless wandering of the early days. They were standing still, a line of them, facing the bunker. Watching. Waiting. They knew I was here. The generator's hum was a beacon. I sat in the commander's chair and opened a new log entry. I typed with dirty, blood-stained fingers. Day 1 of occupation. The bunker is secure, internally. Supplies are sufficient for 3 years. But the enemy is adapting faster than we anticipated. They are organized. They are armored. And they are patient. I am not a survivor anymore. I am a zookeeper, and I am on the wrong side of the cage. I locked the blast doors, engaged the automated perimeter turrets I'd found in the defense grid menu, and listened to the servos whine as they tracked targets outside. The war wasn't over. It had just evolved. The hydraulic seal hissed, a sound like a dying lung exhaling the last of its air, as the heavy steel wheel finally turned. My hands were raw, blisters weeping onto the rusted iron, but the adrenaline spikes masked the pain. I pushed. The blast door groaned, metal shearing against metal, opening just enough for me to slip sideways into the gloom. I didn't wait to see if anything had heard the noise. I squeezed through the gap and hauled the wheel in reverse, sealing the world away. The darkness inside was total, heavy, and smelled of stale recycled air and ozone. It was the smell of 1980s paranoia and modern abandonment. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting a cone through dust motes that had been suspended in silence for decades. I was in an airlock. Decontamination showers to the left, hazmat suits hanging like flayed skins to the right. I ignored them. My Geiger counter remained silent, which was the first piece of good news I'd had in 6 months. I moved deeper, my boots thudding softly on the grating. This wasn't just a storm cellar. The architecture was military grade, designed to outlast the apocalypse, though clearly the occupants hadn't outlasted the initial outbreak. The first level was logistics. I swept the beam across rows of shelving units. Most had been picked over, likely by the staff before they fled, or died, but they had missed the overflow cache behind a false ventilation panel. I pried it open with my combat knife. Jackpot. MREs, but not the civilian garbage. These were brown-bag military rations, menu for pork sausage with gravy. Expiration date 2028. I tore one open immediately, my hands trembling not from fear but from a caloric deficit that had been eating my muscle mass for weeks. I ate it cold, the grease coating my tongue, tasting like salvation. Beside the food crates were water purification tablets and, miraculously, sealed jerry cans of distilled water. I drank until my stomach cramped, the sensation almost overwhelming. But survival isn't just about a full belly, it's about knowing what you're up against. I needed weapons, and I needed intel. The stairwell down to level 2 was blocked by a barricade of office chairs and filing cabinets. It was a hasty, desperate construction. Dried blood, black and flaky like rust, coated the floor in front of it. Someone had held the line here. I climbed over the debris, weapon raised, a battered Glock with 7 rounds left. The silence was oppressive. Level 2 was barracks and medical. This is where the story of the bunker's fall was written. In the infirmary, I found the skeletons. Not in beds but strapped to them. The restraints were leather and steel, gnawed at but unbroken. I approached the nearest gurney. The corpse was desiccated, skin pulled tight over bone like parchment, but the skull was wrong. I leaned in close, the flashlight beam trembling. The orbital sockets were fused shut. Bone had grown over the eyes. The jaw was unhinged, extended, and the teeth had been replaced by jagged ridges of calcified bone. This wasn't the standard rot I'd seen in the cities. The shamblers up top were decomposing bags of meat. This thing had changed. I moved to the nurse's station, brushing aside shattered glass to find a clipboard. The log was dated 3 years ago. Patient 0 exhibits rapid ossification of the dermis. Subject is no longer responding to standard sedatives. The virus is not killing the host, it is fortifying it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the subterranean temperature. Fortifying. The infection was evolving. I shoved the medical logs into my pack. I needed to know more. Scavenging became secondary to intelligence gathering. I raided the supply closet, finding a stash of antibiotics, ciprofloxacin and doxycycline, gold dust in the wasteland. I pocketed surgical tubing, a scalpel, and a bottle of isopropyl alcohol. Then I saw the armory cage. The lock was electronic, dead without power. I used the crowbar I'd looted from a hardware store 3 weeks ago, wedging it into the seam. With a grunt of exertion that echoed dangerously loud, I popped the door. The rack was mostly empty, but on the bottom shelf, ignored in the panic, lay a Remington 870 tactical shotgun and a box of slugs. I checked the action. Smooth. Heavy. It felt like an extension of my arm. I loaded it, the metallic clack-clack of the pump action the most comforting sound in the world. I continued down to level 3, research and containment. The air here was colder. The smell changed. Less dust, more copper and chemical preservative. The emergency lights flickered on a low battery loop, casting red strobes over the hallway. Shadows danced, looking like lurching figures. I kept the shotgun shouldered. At the end of the hall was a reinforced glass observation window looking into a containment cell. I shined my light through the glass. Inside, slumped in the corner, was one of them. But it was huge. The virus had triggered massive muscular hypertrophy. Its skin was gray and thick, like a rhino's hide. Spikes of bone protruded from its shoulders and elbows. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't dead. I could see the shallow rise and fall of its chest. On the console beneath the window lay a heavy binder, Project Tartarus, Strain Delta Evolution. I flipped it open, scanning the frantic handwriting of the lead scientist. The Shamblas are merely the larval stage. Given enough biomass and time, the pathogen rewrites the genetic code completely. They are becoming hunters. They are developing hive-mind coordination. We hear them screaming in the ventilation shafts, not in rage, but in communication. I froze. Communication. The screeches I'd heard in the valley at night, the way the hordes seemed to cut off escape routes before we even knew they were there. They weren't mindless. They were hurting us. I looked back through the glass. The creature's head had lifted. It didn't have eyes, the bone plates covered them, but it was facing me. It sensed the heat, or the smell, or the fear. It stood up, the motion fluid and silent, terrifyingly graceful for something of that size. It placed a hand on the glass. The glass didn't break, but the creature didn't strike it. It just pressed, testing the integrity. I saw the intelligence in the way it tilted its head. It was learning. I backed away slowly, the shotgun trained on the glass. I had food. I had weapons. But I had lost the illusion of safety. The bunker wasn't a fortress, it was a tomb waiting to be sealed. I needed to get back to the surface. I needed to move. The evolution logs spoke of incubation periods and metamorphic triggers. If the things up top were evolving into this, humanity was already extinct, we just hadn't stopped twitching yet. I turned and ran for the stairs, the sound of my boots hammering a frantic rhythm. As I reached the barricade on level 2, I heard it. A deep, resonant thrumming from the ventilation ducts. A sound like 1,000 dry throats clicking in unison. They were inside the walls. They knew I was here. The hunt had begun. The wheel of the blast door was cold enough to burn my palms, a circle of freezing steel that hadn't been touched in maybe 5 years. I had to brace my boot against the frame and heave with every ounce of starvation-fueled adrenaline left in my system. With a groan of tortured metal that vibrated through the soles of my shoes, the locking mechanism disengaged. A hiss followed, the equalization of pressure, and the smell hit me. It wasn't the rot of the surface world, that cloying, sweet stench of decaying city meat. This was different. It smelled like stale ozone, recycled air, and dried copper. I pushed the heavy slab open just enough to squeeze through, my P90 raised, the tactical light cutting a harsh white cone into the abyss. I was inside. The airlock was pristine, save for a layer of dust that looked like gray velvet under the beam. I waited for the motion sensors, the turrets, the automated warnings. Nothing. Just the hum of my own blood in my ears and the dripping of condensation somewhere deep in the dark. I'd bypassed the decontamination showers, no power meant no water, and moved into the atrium. This wasn't just a bolt hole. It was a military-grade research station. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick, reinforced with rebar that I could see exposed in a fissure near the ceiling. That fissure was the first bad sign. Something had shaken this place, hard, from the inside. My priority was sustenance. I moved methodically, clearing corners with the muscle memory of a man who has survived the fall for a decade. The mess hall was a tomb of silence. Upturned tables, trays scattered like plastic confetti. But the pantry was the holy grail. I pried open a heavy steel locker and nearly wept. Marie's. Cases of them. Menu 18, beef ravioli. Menu 23, pizza slice. Expiration dates that had passed 3 years ago, but in the apocalypse, that's gourmet. I tore one open right there, eating the cold, chemically preserved paste with trembling fingers. The caloric intake hit my stomach like a lead weight, but my brain sharpened instantly. With hunger managed, I moved to the armory. The door had been blowtorched open, slag melted onto the floor. Someone had looted it, but they had been in a rush. They took the heavy ordnance, the launchers, the explosives, but they left the precision tools. I found boxes of 5.7 by 28 mm ammunition, the gold-tipped armor-piercing rounds that were rarer than diamonds on the surface. I loaded my magazines until my thumbs blistered. I found a suppressor that actually fit my threading. I was gearing up, feeling safer by the second, but that feeling was a lie. I knew it. Bunkers don't stay abandoned unless they are haunted or condemned. I pushed deeper, past the residential wing and into the sector marked BO containment. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air grew thick, tasting metallic. Here, the scavenging changed from survival gear to information. I needed to know why the world ended, or at least, why this specific part of it died. The hallway was lined with plexiglass observation windows. Inside the first few rooms were the usual horrors: hospital beds with restraints, dried pools of black ichor, shattered centrifuges. But it was the writing on the walls that stopped me. Not graffiti. Biology. A dark, fibrous webbing stretched across the ceiling, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent rhythm. It looked like black mold on steroids, forming vein-like structures that connected the rooms. This was the evolution. On the surface, the Zeds were shamblers, rotting meat driven by a motor cortex virus. But down here, in the dark, the virus had done what viruses do: it mutated to survive the isolation. It had become structural. I entered the chief virologist's office, stepping over a corpse in a hazmat suit that had fused with the floor. The webbing had grown through the suit, knitting the bones into the linoleum. I found a tablet on the desk, its battery dead, but a physical logbook sat beside it, open to the last entry. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. Day 402, the subject isn't consuming the biomass anymore. It's integrating it. The Solanum strain has shifted from a parasitic host driver to a hive mind architect. We thought the aggression was the symptom. It wasn't. The aggression was just the method of gathering raw material. The walkers on the surface? They are just drones gathering meat for the colony. Down here, in the sealed environment, we are seeing the end game. It builds. It connects. It's terraforming the bunker into a single organism. I looked up from the book, shining my light at the far wall. The webbing was thicker there. It throbbed. And then I saw it. The wall wasn't concrete. It was a mass of fused bodies, dozens of them, pressed together and calcified into a barrier. Faces, slack-jawed and gray, protruded from the biomass like gargoyles. They weren't moving, but their eyes. Their eyes were all open, milky white cataracts staring in unison at my light source. I stepped back, my boot crunching on a glass vial. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. Instantly, the wall rippled. The veins on the ceiling flushed a bright, angry crimson. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that wasn't mechanical, it was vocal. 1,000 throats groaning in a low harmony without opening their mouths. The virus wasn't just in them, it was the room. The evolution was psionic or phenomenal, some kind of localized network. One of the faces in the wall, a woman with half her skull seemingly melted into the infrastructure, twitched. Her jaw unhinged, dropping lower than human anatomy allows, and a spore cloud puffed out. Then another. Then the corpse on the floor, the one in the hazmat suit, began to crack. The bones were snapping as the biomass reconfigured them, pulling the body up not like a puppet, but like a spider unfolding its legs. I didn't wait to see the final form. I raised the P90 and fired a burst into the hazmat suit. The rounds hit, but there was no blood. Just dust and that black webbing, which seemed to catch the bullets and knit around them. The hive mind was adapting to kinetic trauma in real time. The text in the logbook flashed in my mind, "It integrates." I turned and sprinted. The hallway behind me erupted with sound, wet tearing noises, the snapping of cartilage, and that low, harmonious groaning rising to a shriek. The lights in the corridor flickered, powered by the bioelectricity of the thing growing in the walls. I wasn't scavenging anymore. I was being rejected by an immune system. The bunker wasn't abandoned. It was occupied by a single, massive resident. I scrambled back through the decontamination zone, the air thick with spores that burned my throat. I could hear heavy, wet thuds behind me, multipedal forms birthed from the wall meat, chasing me down with unnatural speed. I hit the atrium, sliding across the polished floor, and threw myself at the blast door. I jammed the wheel, spinning it shut just as a pseudopod of black muscle whipped through the gap, trying to snare my ankle. The heavy steel slammed home, severing the limb. The tentacle writhed on the floor, dissolving into black sludge that tried to seep into the cracks of the concrete. I spun the locking wheel until my muscles screamed, sealing the tomb. I slumped against the cold metal, gasping for air that didn't taste like copper. I checked my pack. I had the food. I had the ammo. But I also had the knowledge. The surface was dangerous because of the dead. But the underground? The underground was where the dead were learning to become a god. I looked at the severed tentacle dissolving on the floor. It was trying to move toward the darkness of the corner. I stomped it into a smear, burned it with a road flare, and watched it die. The infection wasn't just spreading anymore. It was building a world. And I had just rung the dinner bell. The wheel groaned, a rusted symphony of neglected steel grinding against centuries of silence, or at least what felt like centuries. My gloves, shredded at the fingertips, slipped twice on the cold metal before the mechanism finally caught. With a pressurized hiss that sounded too much like a dying breath, the heavy blast door swung inward, displacing dust that had settled before the world fell apart. I didn't step in immediately. Rule number 1: the dead are patient, but traps are instantaneous. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the threshold. Concrete. Gray, oppressive, and dry. No blood smears, no claw marks, no shattered barricades. It was pristine in its abandonment. The air that drifted out tasted stale, recycled, metallic, the taste of a tomb that hadn't yet realized it was occupied. I stepped into the airlock, the heavy thud of my boots echoing like a dinner bell, and cranked the wheel to seal the world of the shamblers behind me. For the first time in 6 months, I was underground, and for the first time in forever, I felt the phantom sensation of safety. Though I knew it was a lie. The layout was standard military efficiency. I'd bypassed the security checkpoint. The mag locks had failed when the grid went down years ago, and moved straight for the logistics corridor. My stomach twisted, a gnawing knot of hunger that had become my constant companion. Scavenging wasn't just about finding things. It was about the dopamine hit of survival, the gambling addiction of the apocalypse. I found the storage bay behind a reinforced door labeled Quartermaster. It wasn't locked. Inside, the beam of my light revealed the Holy Grail. Floor-to-ceiling shelving units, metal and stoic, lined with crates. I pulled my knife, prying open the first wooden box. Marie's. Not the civilians' trash, but military-grade rations. Brown packets. Menu 18, beef ravioli. I almost wept. I shoved as many as I could into my rucksack, the weight of the calories feeling like gold bullion. Beside the food were water filtration units, spare filters, chemical lights, and ammunition. 5. 56mm rounds, boxed and sealed in moisture-wicking plastic. I loaded mags with trembling hands, the click-clack of the springs sounding like a prayer. This was enough to keep me alive for a year, maybe 2 if I rationed. But supplies were only half the equation. I needed to know why this place was abandoned. Why leave a fortress fully stocked? I pushed deeper, descending to sub-level 2. The air grew colder here, sharper. The signage changed from logistics to research and pathology. The hallway was lined with observation windows, the glass reinforced with wire mesh. Most of the rooms were dark, filled with dormant machinery, but the central lab had power. Emergency red lights bathed the room in a bloody hue. A backup generator, likely geothermal or nuclear decay, was keeping the core systems barely conscious. I approached the main terminal. The screen was dormant, but a tap on the keyboard brought up a login prompt, followed immediately by an override script. Someone had left it unlocked. Someone had wanted this data found. I began to read, and the euphoria of the food discovery evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that settled in my marrow. The logs were authored by a Dr. Eris Thorne. They detailed the early days of the outbreak, the initial panic, the standard containment protocols. But as I scrolled through the timeline, the tone shifted from clinical observation to terrified fascination. The dates corresponded to 6 months ago, around the time the surface radio chatter went silent. The file was titled strain_evolution_phase_2. Docs. I opened it. Attached were high-resolution images taken from drone recon and captured specimens. I looked at the first image. It was a walker, standard variant, decaying, gray flesh, slack jaw. But the second image, taken 3 months later, showed something different. The subject wasn't rotting. Its skin had hardened, turning a dark, obsidian black. Growths, calcified and jagged, protruded from its shoulders and forearms like natural armor. Subject 89, Thorne's log read. Necrosis has halted. The pathogen is no longer just reanimating dead tissue, it is restructuring it. We assumed the virus would burn itself out as the hosts decomposed. We were wrong. The virus is optimizing. The decomposing flesh is being repurposed into a chitinous dermal layer. They are becoming bulletproof. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I had seen one of these things, weeks ago, near the city limits. I thought it was a fluke, a body covered in tar or riot gear. I had run from it, and my 9mm rounds had sparked off its chest. Now I knew why. The infection wasn't just a zombie plague, it was a metamorphosis. The log continued, detailing photosensitivity adaptation. The new strain, the husk variant, hunted primarily at night because the hardening process made them sluggish in direct heat, but in the cold. They were faster. Much faster. They weren't shambling anymore. The muscle fibers were densifying. They could sprint. I moved to the next file, Vector Transmission Airborne Probability. My hand shook as I clicked it. The text was highlighted in red. Fungal bloom observed in stage 3 subjects. The calcified growths are not bone, they are spore pods. Upon traumatic injury or death of the host, these pods rupture, releasing an aerosolized viral load effective within a 20-meter radius. I instinctively checked the seal on my gas mask, tightening the straps until they dug into my skin. I had killed hundreds of them. I had bashed their heads in, sprayed their blood into the air. If the evolution was widespread, melee combat was no longer a survival strategy. It was a suicide pact. Every kill was a biological grenade waiting to go off. I looked away from the screen, my eyes adjusting to the red gloom of the lab. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, behind a thick cylinder of ballistic glass, was a containment unit. I hadn't noticed it before because the frost inside the glass obscured the contents. I walked over, wiping the condensation away with my sleeve. Inside, strapped to a vertical gurney, was one of them. A husk. Its skin was like volcanic rock, cracked and shifting. It had no eyes, just smooth, armored ridges where the sockets should have been. It was perfectly still. Wires ran from its chest into the monitoring equipment. A sticky note was slapped on the glass. Do not terminate. Listening. Listening? I took a step back. The floor grate creaked under my boot. Inside the tank, the creature's head snapped toward me. It didn't moan. It didn't thrash. It vibrated. A low, subharmonic thrumming sound emanated from its chest, vibrating against the glass. The monitor spiked. I looked at the frequency analysis on the screen next to the tank. It wasn't just making noise, it was broadcasting. A complex, rhythmic signal. A beacon. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I wasn't in a bunker. I was in a lure. The reason the place was abandoned, the reason the supplies were left, was because this place had become ground zero for the hive mind. Thorn hadn't fled. He had been harvested or converted. I looked back at the log. The final entry. They don't just hunt. They coordinate. If you are reading this, you have triggered the acoustic wake-up protocol. Run. The red lights in the lab flickered and turned white. The ventilation system roared to life, cycling fresh air, pumping my scent out to the surface. Above me, through the meters of concrete and soil, I felt a vibration. A thud. Then another. Then a scream, not human, but a chorus of shrieking, grinding metal and rage. The husks were answering the call. I grabbed the hard drive, ripping it from the terminal, and sprinted for the door. I had the food. I had the ammo. But as I raced back toward the airlock, hearing the heavy blast doors above me beginning to pound with the fists of 100 armored nightmares, I realized the most valuable thing I had scavenged was the truth. We were no longer surviving the end of the world. We were witnessing the beginning of theirs. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard in 6 months. It severed the connection to the howling wind and the groans of the shambling dead outside, replacing them with a silence so absolute it felt like pressure building in my ears. I stood in the airlock, the red emergency lighting bathing the sterile steel walls in the color of dried blood. The air here tasted metallic, recycled, filtered through scrubbers that had been running on auxiliary power for God knows how long. I checked the Geiger counter strapped to my wrist. The needle barely twitched. Safe from radiation, at least. But safety is a relative term when you're buried 300 feet beneath the earth in a tomb built by the very people who broke the world. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom as the inner door cycled open. The corridor ahead was wide, utilitarian, and littered with the debris of a panicked evacuation that had happened years ago. Papers, clipboards, and overturned gurneys formed an obstacle course of failure. I wasn't looking for history, though. I was looking for calories and ammunition. My stomach cramped, a sharp reminder that my last meal had been a handful of scavenged berries 2 days ago. I moved with the practiced stealth of a survivor, boots rolling heel to toe to silence my footsteps, weapon raised. The M4 carbine in my hands was light, too light. I had half a magazine left. If this place was occupied by the dead, I'd have to get creative. I bypassed the administrative offices. Paper pushers didn't hoard the good stuff. I followed the stenciled lines on the floor, blue for habitation, yellow for labs, red for security. I took the blue line first. The habitation deck was a ghost town of bunk beds and personal lockers. It smelled of stale sweat and old fear. I started prying open lockers with the edge of my combat knife. The first 3 held nothing but rot-eaten clothes and personal photos of families that were likely long dead. The 4th, however, was a jackpot. A stash of military-grade MREs, the vacuum seals still tight. I ripped one open immediately, shoveling cold beef stew into my mouth with trembling fingers. It tasted like chemicals in heaven. I stuffed the rest into my rucksack, along with a pair of fresh socks and a half-full bottle of water. Basic survival needs met. Now for the hard part. I backtracked to the junction and followed the yellow line toward the laboratories. This was where the tension ratcheted up. The doors here were reinforced, and several had been welded shut from the outside. That wasn't standard protocol. That was containment. I found a smashed window on Lab 4 and vaulted through, glass crunching under my boots. The beam of my light played over shattered test tubes and overturned microscopes, but my eyes were drawn to the containment cells along the back wall. They were thick glass cylinders, floor to ceiling. Most were empty, shattered from the inside out. But one was intact. I stepped closer, wiping the grime from the glass. Floating in the murky preservation fluid was a subject. But it wasn't like the ones wandering the surface. The zombies up top were decaying sacks of meat, driven by a primitive hunger. This thing had evolved. The skin had calcified into overlapping plates of gray, chitinous armor. Its fingers had fused and elongated into bone hooks, serrated and terrifying. The jaw unhinged like a snake's. I saw the plaque at the base of the tank, Project Lazarus Strain Delta Day 40. My blood ran cold. The surface walkers were Day 1 infections. They were the baseline. But down here, isolated and concentrated, the virus had continued to work. It wasn't just reanimating dead tissue, it was optimizing it. I moved to a nearby terminal, praying the battery backup held. The screen flickered to life, bathing my face in a green glow. I accessed the research logs, scrolling past the technical jargon to the daily summaries. The lead scientist's voice, transcribed in stark white text, told a story of escalating horror. Day 14. The subjects are communicating. Not vocally, but through pheromonal shifts. They hunt in packs now. Day 28. Photosensitivity has decreased. They are growing armor. Small arms fire is becoming ineffective against the thoracic plating. Day 35. They are remembering. Subject 6 opened the keypad lock. We are initiating total lockdown. I looked back at the tank. The creature inside drifted, its eyes milky white but wide open. If these things got out, or if they were already out there, evolving in the dark corners of the world, humanity wasn't just endangered, we were obsolete. I needed to know how to kill them. I searched the database for countermeasures. The file was corrupted, but a reference to the armory on level 3 mentioned high-velocity rail prototypes. I left the lab, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence of the bunker now felt predatory. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The air currents shifted, bringing a scent that wasn't stale air or rot. It smelled like musk and copper. I followed the red line toward security and the armory. The corridor descended a ramp into deeper darkness. Here, the walls were scarred with bullet holes and deep, gouged claw marks, 3 parallel grooves that tore through the steel paneling. Whatever had happened here, the soldiers had lost. I reached the armory door. It was a massive vault, sealed tight. The keypad was dead. I cursed under my breath and checked the wiring panel. Shredded. I'd have to manually override the locking mechanism, a noisy process that involved a crowbar and a lot of leverage. I wedged the bar into the seam and heaved. Metal groaned, a screech that echoed down the hallway like a dinner bell. I froze, listening. From the depths of the ventilation shaft above me, I heard it. A chittering sound. Like insects, but wet and heavy. Then, the scrape of bone on metal. I redoubled my efforts, adrenaline flooding my system. With a final, agonized screech, the door popped open enough for me to squeeze through. I slipped inside and jammed the crowbar into the gears to hold it shut. The armory was a treasure trove. Racks of assault rifles, crates of grenades, and there, in a secure case, the prototypes. They looked like standard rifles but bulkier, with magnetic accelerators along the barrel. I grabbed one, checking the action. It was heavy, solid. I found the specialized ammunition, dense, depleted uranium slugs designed to punch through the armor I'd seen in the lab. I was loading a magazine when the vent cover in the hallway outside crashed to the floor. The sound was followed by a heavy thud, then another. I peered through the crack in the door. In the erratic strobe of a failing light fixture, I saw them. 2 of them. They were hunched, moving on all fours, their calcified armor clicking softly as they moved. They were sniffing the air. One of them turned its head, and I saw the intelligence in its eyes. It wasn't the vacant stare of a rotter. It was the focused gaze of a hunter. They knew I was here. The research logs were right. The virus had turned them into apex predators. I racked the slide of the prototype rifle, the hum of the charging capacitors whining in the silence. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the prey in a steel box, and the evolution of the species was scratching at the door. I scanned the room for a second exit and saw a maintenance hatch at the back, labeled Incinerator Access. It was a desperate path, likely leading deeper into the bowels of the facility, but the front door was a death sentence. As the first bone claw slammed into the gap of the armory door, shaking the heavy steel frame, I grabbed a satchel of charges and sprinted for the hatch. The war for the surface was over. The war for the underground had just begun, and the enemy was smarter, stronger, and hungry for the only fresh meat left in the world. The wheel of the blast door spun with a screech that sounded like a dying animal, echoing through the concrete throat of the entrance. It took every ounce of my remaining strength to engage the locking mechanism. The heavy steel tumblers thudding into place with a vibration I felt in my teeth. The silence that followed was absolute, a stark, suffocating contrast to the cacophony of the screamer hordes tearing through the forest canopy above. I was sealed in. Safe, theoretically, but buried alive in a Cold War relic that smelled of ozone, stale recycled air, and something sharper, formaldehyde. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that had likely been suspended in stasis for decades until my intrusion disturbed them. The walls were painted a clinical, institutional green, peeling away to reveal raw gray concrete beneath. I wasn't in a fallout shelter meant for civilians. The yellow and black hazard stripes running along the floor and the biometric scanner next to the inner airlock suggested this was a black site facility, a place where the government buried secrets too volatile for the surface. My first priority was securing the perimeter. I moved tactically, sweeping the muzzle of my suppressed carbine across every shadow. The bunker was laid out in a radial pattern, corridors branching off from a central hub like the spokes of a wheel. The air was frigid, biting through my ragged jacket. I checked the corners, clear. I checked the ceiling vents, bolted tight. The facility was dead, powered down to emergency reserves, evident by the rhythmic, low-frequency pulse of amber strip lighting that guided me deeper. I found the generator room first. It was a cavernous space dominated by massive diesel turbines. A quick inspection of the fuel gauges made my heart hammer against my ribs. The tanks were nearly full. Someone had topped this place off before the world ended, anticipating a long stay. I primed the auxiliary system, and with a coughing roar that settled into a steady hum, the bunker woke up. Overhead halogens flickered to life, banishing the shadows but revealing the grime and the neglect. With power restored, I moved to the mess hall. This was the holy grail of scavenging. The shelves were lined not with the usual civilian canned goods, but with military-grade freeze-dried rations, vacuum-sealed MREs, and pallets of bottled water. I tore open a pack of beef stew, eating it cold, the sodium flooding my system and making me realize just how close to starvation I had truly been. But as I scavenged, loading my pack with water purification tablets and high-calorie bars, I noticed the discrepancies. There were half-eaten meals on the tables, mummified by the dry air. A fork dropped mid-bite. A chair overturned. The occupants hadn't packed up and left. They had been interrupted. I found a clipboard on the floor, the paper brittle. It was a chow schedule, but the handwriting devolved into jagged, frantic scribbles near the bottom. Containment breach was written over and over, darkening until the pen had torn through the paper. The real payload, however, wasn't the food. It was the information. I pushed past the residential wing. Where the doors were welded shut from the outside, a chilling detail I filed away for later, and found the research labs. This was the heart of the bunker. The air here was colder, filtered to a sterile purity. Rows of microscopes, centrifuges, and biohazard isolation boxes lined the benches. I found a terminal that was still in sleep mode. Accessing it required a keycard I looted from a desiccated corpse in a lab coat slumped in the corner. As the screen flared to life, I began to understand the true nature of the infection. This wasn't just a random mutation, it was an accelerated evolutionary agent. I pulled up the logs from Dr. Eris Thorne, the head researcher. The dates went back 6 months before the public outbreak. They knew. They were studying it. Subject 82, the log read, displaying a video file. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a man strapped to a gurney began to convulse. This wasn't the shambling, mindless rot we dealt with on the surface. The virus, identified here as the Thanatos strain, didn't just reanimate dead tissue, it rewrote the genetic architecture of the host. I watched as the subject's bone density tripled in a matter of hours. Calcified spurs erupting through the skin of the forearms, and spine to act as natural armor. The jaw unhinged, the masseter muscles swelling to exert biting force capable of shearing through light tactical vest plating. The notes detailed the stages of infection. Stage 1 was the fever and aggression, the vector phase. Stage 2 was the dormancy and necrosis, where the host appeared dead. But Stage 3 was the metamorphosis. The virus utilized the necrosis as fuel, consuming the useless organs, liver, kidneys, spleen, and repurposing the biomass to reinforce the skeletal and muscular systems. They weren't rotting, they were molting. I kept reading, my grip tightening on the desk edge. The log detailed the hive phenomenon. The virus wasn't solitary. It produced a pheromone, undetectable to humans but screamingly loud to the infected, creating a localized neural network. If you alerted one, you alerted them all within a 3-mile radius. This explained the coordinated swarms, the way they seemed to cut off escape routes before we even knew they were there. I found sketches of mutations I hadn't seen yet, creatures with distended, photosensitive eyes adapted for hunting in subway tunnels, and spitters that could project high-velocity corrosive bile derived from their own liquefied stomach acids. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The things outside weren't just monsters. They were the apex predators of a new ecosystem, and we were just an obsolete food source. I moved to the back of the lab, toward a reinforced glass observation chamber. Inside, the lights were off. I shined my flashlight through the thick pane. It was a containment cell for a Stage 4 prototype. The beam caught movement. Something was in there. It was huddled in the corner, skin gray and hardened like carapace, spikes of bone jutting from its shoulders. It didn't look human anymore. It looked like a weapon. It turned its head, shielding its eyes from the light, and I saw the intelligence in its face. It wasn't snarling. It was observing me. The glass was scratched on the inside, deep gouges that nearly compromised the integrity. A sticky note on the console simply read, "Do not terminate. Evolution holds the cure." They had kept it alive. They were feeding it. And based on the smashed equipment, and the blood splatter on the inside of the airlock I had passed, it seemed the specimen had friends. I backed away from the glass, the thrill of the food and safety evaporating into cold dread. I scavenged the rest of the lab with trembling hands, grabbing vials of broad-spectrum antibiotics, surgical kits, and a box of incendiary grenades labeled sterilization protocols. I found a tactical shotgun in the security office, a Benelli M4 with a side saddle of slugs. I loaded it, the mechanical clack offering a small comfort. The bunker was a treasure trove, yes. It had food for years, water, power, and weapons. But as I settled into the security hub, watching the camera feeds of the silent, gray corridors, I realized the truth. The doors to the residential wing weren't welded to keep the infected out. They were welded to keep the staff inside. The breach hadn't come from the surface. It started here. And as I watched the monitor for Sector 4, deep in the maintenance tunnels, I saw a shadow move, something fast, low to the ground, and covered in bone. I wasn't alone in the bunker. I was just the newest lab rat in a maze that had been sealed for a reason. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door ceiling behind me was the sweetest sound I had heard in 6 months. It was a heavy, industrial thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots, severing the connection to the sun-bleached hellscape above. The air down here was stale, tasting of recycled oxygen and ozone, but it didn't smell like rot. That was the first victory. I clicked my tactical light to the high beam. The cone of illumination cutting through the dust motes, dancing in the stagnant atmosphere of the airlock. The decontamination showers were dry, the nozzles crusted with white mineral deposits, silent sentinels of a protocol that no longer mattered. I bypassed the bioscan. Someone had smashed the console long ago, and forced the manual override on the inner door. It groaned, metal shearing against metal, before sliding open just enough for me to squeeze through. What lay beyond was a scavenger's Valhalla, preserved in the amber of catastrophe. It was a central atrium, sleek and gray, branching off into labeled sectors. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of greed and paranoia. I moved systematically, weapon raised, checking corners. Sector A was logistics. I pried open a crate marked with a black hazardous material diamond. Inside weren't chemicals, but MREs, thousands of them. Not the civilian knockoffs we scavenged from looted grocery stores, but military-grade rations with heating elements. I tore one open, the foil wrapper screaming in the silence, and inhaled the chemical scent of preservation. I shoved as many as could fit into my rucksack, the weight comforting. Next were the water filters. Industrial osmosis units, still wrapped in plastic. I found iodine tablets, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and morphine ampoules in a wall-mounted locker. I was trembling. This wasn't just survival, this was a future. But as I moved deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The utilitarian sterility of Sector A gave way to the frantic, chaotic remnants of Sector B, research. Papers carpeted the floor, a confetti of failed containment. Desks were overturned. Monitor screens were shattered. I stepped over a dried pool of blood that looked like spilled varnish, black and flaky. On a pristine lab bench, illuminated by the flickering strobe of a dying emergency light, I found a terminal that was still humming. The backup generator must have been geothermal or nuclear. It had outlasted the world. I wiped the dust from the screen. The log entry was dated 3 weeks after the initial collapse. Subject 84 exhibits rapid mutation of the muscular structure, the text read. I scrolled down, my eyes widening. The pathogen is not merely necrotic. It is reconstructive. The reanimation of dead tissue was a side effect, not the goal. The virus is optimizing. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Optimizing. We had spent months fighting shamblers, mindless, rotting sacks of meat that relied on sheer numbers. We thought decay was our ally, that eventually, they would just fall apart. But the data on the screen suggested otherwise. I opened a file labeled Stage 2 Evolution. The images were grainy, low-light captures from inside a containment cell. The subject wasn't rotting. It was calcifying. Bone spurs were erupting through the skin, forming natural armor plates over the vital organs. The fingers had fused and elongated into osseous hooks. I looked up from the screen, the silence of the bunker suddenly feeling heavy, predatory. I walked toward the back of the lab, where the glass containment units stood. They were cylindrical, filled with murky, yellowed formaldehyde. Most were empty, shattered from the inside out. Shards of reinforced glass crunched under my boots. I approached the only intact tank. Floating inside was a torso, severed at the waist. But the spine had branched. Tendrils of nervous tissue, thick as coaxial cables, trailed from the spinal column, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent rhythm. It wasn't dead. It was dormant. The infection wasn't just making zombies. It was building a hive. The notes on the clipboard hanging next to the tank confirmed my worst fears. The mycelial network allows for nonverbal communication over vast distances. Pheromonal signaling suggests a hierarchy. They are waking up. A sound from the ventilation duct above me froze my blood. It wasn't a moan. It was a click, a sharp, staccato chattering, like stones being struck together. I killed my flashlight instantly, plunging the lab into the red gloom of the emergency strobes. I crouched behind the lab bench, gripping my rifle, sweat stinging my eyes. The vent cover rattled, screws shearing off with terrifying ease. Something dropped to the floor with a wet, heavy slap. It didn't shuffle. It moved with fluid, predatory grace. In the strobe light I saw it. It was humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched tight over bands of muscle that twitched with restless energy. Its face was gone, replaced by a fissure of jagged bone and sensory tendrils that tasted the air. This was the optimization. A hunter. It turned its head, the tendrils oscillating, and I realized with horror that it couldn't see me. But it could smell the adrenaline pumping through my veins. It let out a low, vibrating purr that rattled the beakers on the table. I needed to move. I grabbed a glass beaker from the table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the far wall. The creature vanished, a blur of motion, covering 30 feet in a second, slamming into the wall where the noise originated. Its claws tore gouges into the concrete. I didn't wait. I sprinted for the door, my boots thudding on the linoleum. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, a high-pitched frequency that made my teeth ache. I hit the corridor, sliding on the papers, and spun around, raising my rifle. The thing erupted from the lab doorway, climbing the walls like a spider, defying gravity with hooked limbs. I squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the corridor in blinding bursts. Rounds impacted the creature, but where they should have torn through flesh, they sparked against bone armor. It didn't stop. It dropped to the floor and zigzagged, closing the distance. I aimed for the center mass, the exposed fleshy fissures between the plates. Black ichor sprayed the wall. It stumbled, screeching, one of its limbs shattered. I didn't let up. I emptied the magazine, the bolt locking back with a metallic clack. The creature convulsed, thrashing on the floor, its nervous system overloading. I fumbled for a reload, my hands shaking violently. The creature let out one final, gurgling click before going still. I stood over it, breathing hard, the smell of cordite and copper filling my nose. I looked closely at the corpse. The bone plates weren't just random growths. They were shaped to deflect impacts. The muscle fibers were denser than anything human. I looked back down the dark corridor of Sector B. From the darkness, I heard it, faint at first, then growing louder. More clicking. Dozens of them. I wasn't in a shelter. I was in an incubator. The surface world belonged to the dead, but the underground belonged to something else entirely. I turned and ran back toward the heavy blast door of the airlock, the riches of the supply room forgotten. The evolution had already happened, and we were generations behind. The heavy steel wheel was cold against my blistered palms, a biting chill that seeped through the ragged leather of my gloves. I leaned my entire body weight into it, boots slipping on the moss-slicked concrete of the entryway, gritting my teeth until my jaw ached. With a screech of rusted metal that echoed like a dying scream through the surrounding forest, the mechanism gave way. Air hissed, a vacuum seal breaking after God knows how long. The smell hit me instantly, not the copper tang of fresh blood or the cloying sweetness of rot that permeated the world above, but the sterile scent of recycled oxygen and ozone. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the gloom, and stepped into the throat of the earth. The heavy blast door swung shut behind me with a finality that made my heart stutter. I was in. I was safe. Or so I prayed. The beam of my light revealed a long, descending corridor lined with conduit pipes and emergency lighting cages that had long since burned out. The silence was absolute, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, louder than the chaotic noise of the horde I'd evaded 3 miles back. I moved slowly, my boots crunching on grit. Every instinct honed over the last 2 years screamed that enclosed spaces were coffins, but the Geiger counter on my belt remained silent. And the air, though stale, was breathable. Level 1 was logistics. My beams swept over rows of metal shelving, some toppled, others pristine. This wasn't just a bolt hole, it was a fortress. I'd bypassed the administrative offices. Paper was useless to me unless I needed kindling, and headed straight for the mess hall. The scavenging instinct took over, a dopamine hit of anticipation that momentarily dulled the chronic pain in my knees. I vaulted a reception desk, landing in a pile of scattered clipboards, and pushed through the double doors of the cafeteria. It was a goldmine. The skeletal remains of the staff were huddled in the corners, desiccated and motionless. Seemingly self-terminated before the infection could take hold. I ignored them, focusing on the pantry. Shelf-stable MREs, crates of freeze-dried fruit, gallon jugs of distilled water. I tore open a packet of beef stew, eating it cold with my fingers. Tears stinging my eyes at the taste of salt and protein that didn't come from a rat. I filled my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders, prioritizing calories and hydration tablets. But survival isn't just about food. I needed to understand why this place went dark. I moved deeper, descending the stairwell to level 2, research and containment. The atmosphere shifted here. The air was colder, and the walls were lined with reinforced glass observation decks. I swept my light over a nurse's station, freezing when the beam hit the wall. It was covered in frantic scrawlings, written in marker, blood, and charcoal. Calcification rate 400%. One note screamed. Not dead. Changing. Read another. I approached a shattered containment unit. Inside, the metal gurney was twisted, the steel restraints snapped like twine. On the floor lay a datapad, its battery long dead, but next to it was a physical logbook. I flipped it open, the pages crinkling. The entries described the early days of the outbreak, confirming what we whispered around campfires. It wasn't just a rage virus. It was an evolutionary accelerant. The initial stage, the shambling, biting corpses, was just the chrysalis. The log detailed Stage 2, subjects developing dermal plating, fused ribcages acting as natural body armor. Stage 3, mentioned ocular atrophy and heightened echolocation. My blood ran cold. The things outside were getting faster, stronger, but down here, in this pressurized incubator, the virus had been allowed to run its course without the interference of the elements. I wasn't alone. I felt it before I heard it, a vibration in the floor grates. I killed the light. Darkness swallowed me, heavy and suffocating. I drew my sidearm, a battered 9mm with only 7 rounds left. I breathed through my mouth, slowing my heart rate. Click. Click. A sound like wet knuckles cracking echoed from the far end of the corridor. It wasn't the groaning of the mindless dead. It was a rhythmic, predatory sound. I pressed my back against the cold glass of the observation deck, my eyes adjusting to the faint green glow of the emergency exit signs down the hall. A silhouette detached itself from the shadows. It was humanoid, but wrong. Taller, elongated. Its skin was pale gray, mottled with dark, crusty patches that looked like barnacles. It didn't walk with a shuffle, it moved with a twitchy, insectal grace. It stopped at the nurse's station, tilting its head. Where the eyes should have been, there were only smooth, bone-like ridges. The logbook was right. Blind. It hunted by sound. My boot squeaked on the linoleum, a microscopic shifting of weight, and the thing's head snapped toward me with impossible speed. It let out a shriek that wasn't human, a high-pitched modulation that vibrated in my teeth. It charged. I didn't hesitate. I brought the flashlight up, strobing it on to blind any residual light sensitivity, and fired. The muzzle flash illuminated a nightmare. The bullet sparked off the creature's chest, actual sparks. The dermal plating. It was like shooting a tank with a BB gun. The impact staggered it, but didn't penetrate. I scrambled back, slipping on loose papers, as the thing lunged, its fingers elongated into hooked, calcified claws. It swiped, tearing through the sleeve of my jacket and grazing my forearm. Pain flared, hot and sharp. I kicked out, connecting with its knee, forcing a sickening crunch, but it didn't scream. It just hissed and scrambled forward. I aimed for the head, the only place that might still be soft. 2 shots. One ricocheted off the hardened brow ridge, shattering a glass partition behind me. The second caught it in the open mouth. Black ichor sprayed the wall, and the creature convulsed, thrashing on the floor. It didn't die instantly. The nervous system was rewired for redundancy. It spasmed, claws gouging trenches into the concrete, before finally going still. I stood over it, chest heaving, the metallic smell of spent gunpowder mixing with the foul, chemical stench of the creature's blood. This was the future. The shamblers outside were going to turn into this. The rotters were becoming armored alphas. I scavenged the creature's corpse, not for loot, but for intel. I used my knife to pry at the plating. It wasn't just callus. It was bone growing through the skin, an exoskeleton formed from the host's own skeleton turning inside out. The virus was building a better predator. I limped toward the armory on the far side of the level, my arm throbbing. The biolock was disengaged. Someone had left it open in a hurry. Inside, the racks were mostly bare, picked clean by the security team before they fell, but I found a prize worth more than gold. A tactical shotgun and a box of slugs. Regular lead wouldn't stop these things, but a 1-ounce slug might crack their shells. I also found a hazmat suit, the yellow polymer thick and reassuring. I stripped off my tattered gear, cleaning the scratch on my arm with aggressive amounts of rubbing alcohol until I saw stars. Praying the virus wasn't transmitted by scratch. I sealed myself in the suit. The bunker wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb of failed science. I packed the shotgun, the food, and the logbook. The world needed to know. The survivors needed to know that walls wouldn't save us. And that waiting out the infection was a death sentence because the infection wasn't dying, it was maturing. I climbed back up to the surface, the weight of the new gear heavy, but the weight of the knowledge heavier. I cracked the blast door, the sunlight blinding me for a moment. I stepped out, not as a scavenger, but as a soldier in a war that had just changed rules. The wheel of the blast door was cold enough to burn my palms, a circle of freezing steel that hadn't been turned in years. I had to brace my boot against the frame, gritting my teeth until my jaw ached, putting every ounce of my dwindling strength into the torque. With a shriek of grinding metal that echoed like a gunshot across the silent valley, the seal broke. A hiss of escaping air, stale, pressurized, smelling of ozone and dead dust, hit my face. I didn't wait for the noise to attract the wanderers outside. I slipped through the widening crack, pulled the heavy lever on the inside to engage the hydraulics, and watched the slit of gray daylight vanish. Darkness swallowed me, absolute and suffocating, until the crimson beam of my tactical light cut a cone through the gloom. I was in. The silence underground was heavier than the silence above. Above ground, there was always the wind, the rustle of dead leaves, or the distant, wet gurgle of a shambler. Here, the silence was pressurized. My boots on the grated metal floor sounded like hammer strikes. I kept my weapon raised, a scarred carbine with less than a full magazine left, sweeping the corners. The air was dry, filtered, and recycling systems hummed deep within the bowels of the concrete sarcophagus. This wasn't just a storm shelter, the layout screaming military-grade redundancy. Yellow stripes on the floor led to different sectors: command, barracks, medical, research. I followed the yellow line to the barracks first. Survival hierarchy dictated water and ammunition before answers. The lockers were a goldmine, a heartbreaking capsule of a world that ended on a Tuesday. I found pristine fatigues, stiff with starch, hanging in rows. I stripped off my filth-encrusted jacket, the fabric stiff with old blood and road grime, and pulled on a clean thermal layer. It felt like a luxury so intense it was almost painful. In the footlockers, I found MREs, brown packets of chemically preserved life. I tore one open, devouring the peanut butter paste without bothering to knead it, the calories hitting my system like a drug. But the real prize was the armory cage at the back. It had been picked over, likely by the personnel fleeing or fighting, but they had missed a crate tucked under a workbench. 56mm rounds. Green-tipped penetrators. I sat on the cold floor, weeping silently as I loaded my magazines, the metallic click-clack of the springs the most beautiful song I'd ever heard. With my belly full and my weapon heavy, curiosity began to override caution. I moved deeper, past the living quarters and toward the research sector. The blast doors here were reinforced, glass thick enough to stop a tank round. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the smell changed. It wasn't the rot of the surface, that sweet, cloying scent of decaying meat. This smelled like copper and bleach. I found a terminal and what looked like the head researcher's office. The power reserve was critical, but the screen flickered to life, bathing the room in an amber glow. I began to read, and the sense of safety I'd felt in the barracks evaporated. The logs detailed the early days of the infection, designated pathogen Omega. The world thought it was a rage virus, something that turned people into mindless cannibals. The data here told a different story. The initial outbreak, the shamblers, the biters, that was just the incubation phase. The pathogen wasn't killing the host, it was rewriting the genetic architecture to support a new organism. The logs described stage 2 evolution occurring within closed environments where the host wasn't subjected to the elements. Without the sun to degrade the tissue and the cold to freeze the muscles, the infection didn't rot, it bloomed. I scrolled further, my finger trembling on the scroll wheel. Subject 44B, the log read. Metabolic processes have stabilized. The subject no longer requires caloric intake from external sources. It has begun to synthesize energy from ambient radiation and fungal growth on the dermis. Dermal hardening observed. Bone density increased by 300%. I looked up from the screen, staring through the observation window into the dark lab below. The glass was smeared from the inside. Not with blood, but with a thick black resin. I needed antibiotics. The scratch on my ribs from a scuffle 3 days ago was hot to the touch, the veins around it turning a spiderweb purple. The medical bay was attached to the research lab. I had to go down there. I checked the seal on my mask, racking the charging handle of the carbine. I moved to the stairwell, descending into the belly of the beast. The lower level was a nightmare of biology gone wrong. The sterile white tiles were covered in a carpet of gray, fibrous mold that dampened sound. It felt like walking on dead muscle. I stepped over a corpse, or what used to be one. It hadn't rotted. It had fused to the floor, the fungal growth anchoring it like roots. Its face was gone, replaced by a calcified plate of bone. This was stage 2. The infection eventually sealed the host off from the world, turning them into statues until a trigger event occurred. I reached the pharmacy cage. The glass was shattered. I vaulted the counter, sweeping the flashlight over the shelves. Doxycycline. Amoxicillin. I grabbed handfuls of bottles, stuffing them into my pack. I was greedy, distracted by the horde. I didn't hear the cracking sound until it was too loud to ignore. In the hallway, one of the statues was moving. It didn't groan like the ones above. It made a clicking, chittering sound, like insects rubbing legs together. The calcified plating on its joints cracked as it tore itself free from the resin on the floor. It stood a foot taller than a man, its limbs elongated, fingers fused into bone spikes. It had no eyes, just that smooth, armored plate where a face should be. It tilted its head, listening. The silence I had made was gone. The sound of the pill bottles rattling in my bag must have been like a siren to it. I raised the rifle, aiming for center mass, then corrected. The log said bone density was tripled. I aimed for the knees. The thing moved with terrifying speed, a blur of gray motion. I squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash illuminating the horror and strobe light flashes. The round sparked off its chest plate, chipping the bone but not stopping it. It didn't feel pain. It only knew aggression. It lunged, closing the distance in 2 strides. I dropped to the floor, rolling under a gurney as its spiked hand smashed into the metal where my head had been, shearing through steel tubing like it was paper. I scrambled back, firing wildly into its legs. One round found purchase in the soft tissue behind the knee. It screeched, a sound like metal tearing, and collapsed. It wasn't dead, just mobilized. I didn't wait to finish it. I sprinted for the stairs, my lungs burning, the heavy pack bouncing against my infected side. Behind me, I heard others waking up. The cracking of calcified shells echoed down the corridor like popping corn. I hit the stairwell and slammed the fire door, spinning the wheel lock just as a heavy body slammed against it. The metal buckled outward, the impact dust raining down on me. I backed away, chest heaving, listening to the rhythmic pounding on the other side. They were testing the weakness. They were learning. I retreated to the upper levels, back to the heavy blast door of the entrance. I couldn't leave. It was night now, and the valley would be crawling with the feral ones. But I couldn't stay down here, not with those things below. I dragged a heavy metal desk in front of the stairwell door, then a filing cabinet, building a barricade. I sat with my back to the cold steel of the airlock, the antibiotics in my hand, the rifle across my lap. I swallowed 2 pills dry. The bunker wasn't a sanctuary. It was a petri dish. The things outside were just the failures, the ones that rotted before they could ripen. The things inside, they were the future. And as I listened to the scraping of bone against metal from the floors below, I realized that eventually, that door would give. And when it did, the evolution would spill out into the world. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds left. Enough to fight for a while. or enough to make sure I didn't become one of them.